Well, West Side Story was groundbreaking for a number of reasons, and really all four of the creators had a lot to do with it. Some of it was just the way the score was structured. Um, Stephen Sondheim has spoken about the fact that they were very influenced by film in the way that they conceived the show, so that cutting from scene to scene could be an abrupt cut without explanation, and suddenly we're in a new moment in a new scene, and you therefore sort of count on the imagination of your audience to put the pieces together. It's something that we accept in film, and we now accept in stage work readily, but it was relatively new in West Side Story. I've spoken about the dance and how revolutionary the dancing itself was, and the idea that dance could propel the show. Not just that you could continue the narrative as the dance unfolds, but that the dance would essentially become another character of the show itself, that the aggression of the sharks and the jets was best played out, and the violence was played out through dancing. But musically speaking, and that's what we're mainly here to talk about, it was absolutely groundbreaking, and I think in only the way that Bernstein could have accomplished. Bernstein brought to it his entire background as an artist. So he was a wonderful improviser, he was a jazz musician, he was a terrific pianist. He was steeped in Broadway. He knew Gershwin and loved shows like Of Thee I Sing of Gershwin. But he also was a protege of the what we'll call the Nadia Boulanger students. He learned from the same folks that Igor Stravinsky learned from, that Copland learned from. And if there's anything about Bernstein, he was a chameleon. He was a sponge. So in West Side Story, you hear elements of jazz. You hear Latin rhythms and elements of Latin popular music. You hear the traditions of Broadway. You hear Bernstein's romantic orchestra, and there are moments in West Side Story which for all the world sound like late romantic symphonic writing, certainly parts of Somewhere. But then you also hear Copland, and you hear the modernist tendencies of presenting two chords that are different simultaneously, as if we're in two keys at once. And Bernstein uses those very creatively to show the clashing of cultures that West Side Story represents. Then, of course, you get into the issues of multiculturalism, of ethnic tension that the story is ultimately about. It's a rewriting of the Romeo and Juliet story. So there's the clash of lovers from different cultural sides of the divide. But it's heightened in West Side Story because it's about the society that we live in. It was about present-day New York in 1957. It ended up being called West Side Story, and they changed it from a conflict between Catholics and Jews to a conflict between Puerto Ricans and Americans. Of course, we all know that Puerto Ricans are Americans. The Americans in question are presumably based on people of Polish descent, would have been what would have been represented in West Side Story 1957, in a neighborhood that was eventually, for the most part, razed and replaced by Lincoln Center, ironically, which became Leonard Bernstein's home when he was music director of the New York Philharmonic, just a very few years later, in 1963. So West Side Story opened in 1957, showed these ethnic conflicts, and yet it was by the four men I've mentioned, all of them white, all of them male, all of them Jewish, which also was an absolute, almost de rigueur norm for Broadway at the time. You think of Gershwin, whom I've already mentioned, or Irving Berlin, or Kurt Weill. It was a male, white, Jewish world, Broadway, and this was their creation. But it was a very progressive idea about the races living together, and still for all of that, there wasn't a sensitivity about biracial casting, or at least a mandate. that casts should be integrated racially for presenting an interracial subject. And West Side Story, like many other musicals, like Showboat, like South Pacific, has been popular since the day it's opened, and it's been revived many, many times. And so we can see the different ways in which these subjects of ethnic conflict have been presented over the decades, and how the directorial decisions have changed over time about casting, and about how the language of the show, how should Spanish speakers be presented on stage. That's changed since the show opened in 1957. So in 2009, when Arthur Lawrence directed it, he asked Lin-Manuel Miranda, the creator of Hamilton, to write some Spanish translations of Stephen Sondheim's lyrics, which Miranda rather beautifully said was the hardest assignment I ever had, translating Sondheim for Broadway into Spanish. But there was a sense that Spanish speakers should be able to speak Spanish. And Lawrence said, not like they studied in high school either, real Spanish, or Spanglish, as it's spoken on the street. So what's the translation of all that in Akron? We don't have a large Puerto Rican community in Akron. We don't even have a large Hispanic community, though we have a healthy number of talented Hispanics who live in Northeast Ohio. And I'm proud to say that we've put together a very diverse cast for our West Side Story. Our Maria, in fact, is Puerto Rican. She lives in Puerto Rico, has made her career, though, throughout the United States, including in Puerto Rico, but also has been a resident artist in Dayton, but she's making her debut here with us, and I'm very excited to have her with us. Connor O'Brien will be back as our Tony, who he performed in our production of Titanic and is well known to audiences in Northeast Ohio, both on the classical side and on the popular music side. So we have a diverse and brilliantly talented cast, and I'm always so gratified when we hang out the advertisement for performances of musicals or theater-based work with the Akron Symphony. We always have a really robust turnout. We had days of auditions, and I'm really proud of our cast and excited to present them with the full Akron Symphony on stage.